So welcome back to the people in the room here in Canberra and to those online. I understand there are 50 or so people online currently, which, as was mentioned earlier on, is a great testament to people's fortitude in terms of different time zones around the world. So my name's Daniel Walker. I'm from the CSIRO, which is, for those international visitors and those online, is Australia's National Science Agency, Applied Science Agency. So I'm chairing this session. Nikki Grigg, my colleague also from CSIRO, will be moderating on behalf of the people online, so I'll be relying on Nikki to provide questions from the online community interacting with us today. One final small housekeeping issue for those of you who need Wi-Fi access here in this room. If you ask at the registration desk, they can give you details for sign-on for Wi-Fi. So this session I'm going to introduce two speakers. First of all, Professor Gerald Midgley, who's the Professor of Systems Thinking at the University of Hull. Previously spent 7 years at the New Zealand Crown Research Institute in an applied policy research environment. Gerald's also the President of the International Society for Systems Sciences, and many of you will know him from his publications, extensive publications in systems sciences. So I'll hand over first to Gerald for his paper.
Thank you very much. Let me say hello to the people online. I understand there's about as many people online as there are in the room, which is fantastic. What I want to talk about are these things. I'm going to use the wicked problems language for a purely pragmatic reason that policymakers tend to use that language, and so I'm happy to do that. There are issues with it, but we can discuss that in questions and answers if you want. I want to look at what is systems thinking. I think the reason that I got the invitation to talk about systems thinking is because I've spent 20 years really researching the plurality of systems ideas and how you can deal with the fact that we've had 100 years of research, and there's a little irony that systems thinking is supposed to be transdisciplinary, and what it's ended up doing is fragmenting into a huge number of different systems communities with hundreds of different methodologies, and the big question is how you can deal with that kind of plurality. So I want to say a little bit about that plurality and present 4 different systems approaches for different purposes, acknowledging absolutely that I've picked 4 well-practiced ideas out of a multitude. And I'll leave you with 3 systemic principles for addressing wicked problems. So I'll say very little about wicked problems, because Gabriel already covered that under her title of complex problems. Just pick out some words from this slide. So interlinked issues, cutting across usual silos, complexity, multiple agency, multiple scales, multiple viewpoints, conflict, power relations, uncertainty about the possible effects of action. So these are the kinds of issues that I'm interested in. I acknowledge that not all systems approaches are designed to deal with wicked problems, but I'm particularly interested in those kinds of contexts. So what is systems thinking? Well, we can split that into 2 words. We can start with thinking. If you think about thinking, thinking uses language. Language is socially shared. So actually dialogue helps us think. So this is not a naive notion of thinking as just something that goes on in your mind. Thinking is both personal and it's collective. And given that huge variety of systems ideas, how can we actually make sense of them? There are lots of different theories of plurality. But I came across a really nice framework in 2008 from Derek Cabrera and colleagues. They did some research across different mature systems approaches and said there are 4 systems thinking skills that underpin all of these approaches. And when I saw this framework, I thought, well, I'll tinker with that a little bit, change the language a little bit, that's okay. But what I realized is that he was saying we use these kinds of thinking every day. And I was saying, I looked at this and I thought, there's something more to it than this. You actually look at the variety of systems methodologies and you realize that each one prioritizes different systems thinking skills. So it provides a really neat framework to present at least some of the plurality. And I use this framework to talk to policymakers so that I can present systems thinking not as just one little bit of the big puzzle, but with a bit more plurality than you'd normally be able to present. So 4 systems thinking skills: thinking in terms of boundaries, what you include and exclude, thinking in terms of relationships, causal connections, those kinds of things, thinking in terms of the system itself, the idea of a whole, that it has emergent properties, that systems are nested, and thinking about multiple perspectives, given that whether even it's a system or not will depend on the particular perspective. Now, when we begin to look at systems approaches, I want to acknowledge first of all that I'm talking about systems approaches that are about intervention through research to actually bring about change. So I'm talking about systemic action research rather than simple observation. Science from a systems thinking perspective is one useful approach that you can harness in the service of intervention. So these 4 systems thinking skills suggest 4 different types of approach. So there's approaches for exploring value and boundary judgments about what should be included or excluded or marginalised as well. There are approaches for understanding complex causality, feedback, vicious and virtual circles, possible consequences of intervention. There's approaches for developing viable, highly responsive organisations for looking at systems at multiple scales. And there's approaches for addressing conflict and exploring multiple perspectives, agreeing solutions that people are willing to implement. So you can see already that the breadth of different kinds of systems approaches. And what I want to do is give you just 4 examples of those approaches in no depth whatsoever, given that I've got so little time. I'm going to give you brief snapshots of my own work using those different approaches, just to give you a flavour of what it means in practice. So let's start here, approaches for exploring value and boundary judgments. And I want to go back to the late 1960s and start with a basic assumption of systems approaches that everything in the universe is directly or indirectly connected to everything else. But human beings always have a partial view. There's no God's eye view of that interconnectedness. And we have a partial view in 2 senses. The word partial has 2 meanings. So it's partial in the sense that we can't see the whole, and it's partial in the sense that values are key in helping us draw boundaries. So it's partial in the sense that it's value-driven. The diagram represents the ellipse there represents the inclusion of stakeholders and issues, and the peak there represents values. And there's a 2-way relationship between values and boundaries. So the values that you bring into any kind of analysis or any kind of action will help drawing the boundaries that matter. And values are not general principles, they're linked to our purposes and our priorities for action. But we don't live in a world where there are no pre-given boundaries. So we live in a world where institutions already draw boundaries for us, and those boundaries constrain the kinds of values that it's possible to express at any particular moment. So there's a 2-way relationship between boundaries and values. And it's through exploring the value judgments as well as the boundary judgments and looking at different possible boundaries that you begin to have greater comprehensiveness than you would if you just took one boundary for granted. There's also a whole bunch of theory associated with this work that I've been developing since the early work in the 1960s and 1980s. And it's theory about conflict processes, what happens when people make different boundary and value judgments, how they frame the same things differently. There's theory about marginalisation processes, how stakeholders and issues become marginalised, how that becomes stabilised in social systems instead of resolved. All that kind of thing is really important, but I don't have time to go into that. And I just want to give you one little example of a project in which the identification of marginalisation, so the boundaries of who was being marginalised, were critical. So this was a project about developing services for young people under 16 living on the streets. This was a project in Manchester, UK. There's something like 2,000 children in only 1 year living on the streets of Manchester. And we were tasked by some voluntary organisations to work with a wide variety of agencies, none of whom had statutory responsibility to deal with this, and they wanted to get people engaged. But we wanted to place young people at the centre of this work, and we realised they're marginalised in two respects. So they're regarded as less rational, less able to make informed decisions about their own lives than adults, and living on the streets, they often get involved in petty crime and prostitution just to keep themselves going if they're on the streets for any length of time. So these are the kinds of boundary issues that we had to deal with. And we dealt with this in the project, first of all, by seeking the young people's views themselves before involving professionals. So we didn't want the boundaries that professionals are going to use to dominate and pre-frame the inquiry. So we wanted the young people's voices themselves first. We communicated their words and not just ours to professionals. So we found ways of drawing big diagrams of the problems and putting their words over the top of that. And the emotional impact of that secured commitment to change. The emotional impact is actually important to intervention. And a critical thing that we disagreed about as a research team is about using design methods. Some people wanted to use different design methods with young people as with the adults. And in the end we decided not to do that, and we found that young people were much more able often to deal with the issues that affected them than the professionals who felt quite disempowered by their own agencies. So it was a very effective way, by actually using the same design methods, you can get comparability between what young people were saying and what the agencies were saying, and valuing young people's voices equally. So moving on to approaches for understanding complex causality. I'm not going to dwell on this because George Richardson is going to give a talk on system dynamics later, and I was going to use system dynamics as an example. But this huge, horrible pile of spaghetti is from a project that I worked on in New Zealand, where New Zealand has the highest rate of Campylobacter food poisoning in the Western world, in the developed world. And we wanted to look at how bacteria get transferred from animals to humans. And it's a highly conflictual problem because of the enormous importance of farming to the economy. So you have stakeholders that blame each other for this kind of problem. So we came into this problem where people would not be willing to talk with each other. And by doing these system dynamics maps of what each group thought was the causality of the problem, and then bringing them together where they actually had to look for the connections between the different elements that they'd identified, and the groups ended the workshop realizing that they had to talk with one another because their perspectives on it were not independent of one another. You couldn't actually deal with one without taking the others seriously. So the third one here is approaches for developing viable and highly responsive organizations. And I want to give you just one example, and that's the viable system model, which was developed originally by Stafford Beer in the 1950s, and there's been ongoing research over the years developing it further. I'll just give you a little snapshot of this, highly simplified. Imagine you're designing an organization, and this is the environment of your organization. This is what it has to deal with. Your first task is to identify those aspects of the environment that your organization needs to deal with, some needs in that environment. And so it needs operational units to address those needs. Because those operational units will have different needs at different times, there may be clashes of priorities, it needs coordination. It needs day-to-day management that can oversee the work of those operational units. And the principle there is that you look at when those operational units go beyond the boundaries of acceptability. You don't try to micromanage them. You need foresight to look at the environment and what's happening as the environment changes, and the capacity of your organization to deal with that variety, and you need policy. And the idea of this model is that within each of those operational units you'll find this again. So it's a recursive model, it's a multi-layered model. And you can use this to either diagnose problems in your own organisation, or you can use this to design new organisations. And I used it actually with colleagues in New Zealand when I worked for a Crown Research Institute in a multidisciplinary group, interdisciplinary group. We worked on how we actually define our operational units in ways that reflected the policy environment. And usually I've done exercises defining research priorities and research groups over and over again. And usually what happens is people define things and then they go off and do their own thing and they don't pay much attention to it. And those labels just collapse. These ones actually lasted. They lasted for years because they were really defined with the policy environment in mind. And we looked at things like how we build foresight into our groups and strategy and this kind of thing. And the last approach I want to introduce you to is an approach for addressing conflict and exploring multiple perspectives. This is really my own personal favourite area in systems, and there are so many methodologies, but I had to pick one. So I picked soft systems methodology because it's one of the most widely explored, and I'll take you very briefly through the process. So soft systems methodology says, well, start by exploring the mess, map the mess. You're not dealing with a system necessarily, you're just dealing with a messy problem that nobody can see the whole picture, so you map the mess. One mechanism for doing that is to get a huge sheet of paper across a wall and get everybody collectively to start drawing a picture of what's happening. This is a picture that came from a project in New Zealand where we did a feasibility study for developing a new dam. Now, you don't have to know what that picture means. It's not important. It doesn't have to communicate to the outside world. But the people who drew that picture know what it means. So they began to see the larger picture unfolding. After mapping the mess, you start to explore different transformations that different people want to see. And you explore what those means to different people, what those mean to different people. And the trick here is not to force agreement on one transformation at that very early stage of inquiry. It's a mistake that you often see, that people have an insight of something they can do and everybody piles into it and thinks, yes, let's do that. And you don't explore the variety of perspectives. So you keep that variety of perspectives open. And Peter Checkland, who developed soft systems methodology, offers a mnemonic, and I've adapted this a little, to help get people on the same page what they mean when they're talking about a transformation. So a transformation, which is the third bullet point down, is where you are now and what you want to move to. And underpinning that is some kind of worldview or perspective, assumptions. There are beneficiaries that you can name. There are actors, people who are going to actually bring that transformation about. There are owners, and owners is not a financial owner, but they're people who can stop the transformation from happening. There could be victims that you might need to identify and decide if those are acceptable. And there are environmental constraints that we can debate. What do you have to take as given? What in the policy environment, for example, do you have to take as given? Or what can you actually realistically change? So by exploring those kinds of questions, people stop talking past one another, because one of the big dangers is everybody agrees a transformation and then it all unravels down the line when they realize they're using language to mean different things. And then mapping the activities that are needed to make that transformation a reality. So here's an example. This example comes from a project I did with the Ministry for Research, Science and Technology in New Zealand. No longer exists, it's got another name now. But this ministry had developed 4 roadmaps for long-term investment, 30 years investment in biotech, nanotech, energy and environment research. And they produced these roadmaps and they wanted us to evaluate the process they'd used for developing those roadmaps. So not the content, but the process. And we worked with a whole bunch of stakeholders and with ministry staff. And this model that you've got up here is where they started from. I won't show you the detail, but I'll just point you to point 2 and point 3 on it. So point 2 is set up the individual roadmaps, and point 3 is communicate early thinking with stakeholders. They only made one change in the roadmap process. They reversed those 2 steps. They realized through the engagement with stakeholders that they had pre-framed those roadmaps too much, so that when they took out those roadmaps to stakeholders, there was stakeholder resistance to them, instead of actually listening to the stakeholders first and then allowing the framing to emerge from that work with stakeholders. So you can see how, if you talked with the CEO of that ministry, when she saw these maps, she said this was a really neat codification. She hadn't really realized what kind of process they were using until she saw it down on paper like this. And the changes to it made a real difference. So when they took out the next roadmap, there was a very different stakeholder reaction to it. So soft systems methodology basically ends by looking for then accommodations between different perspectives. And an accommodation is different from a compromise. It's different from a consensus. So an accommodation doesn't assume everybody agrees. It just assumes that people can identify a reasonable way forward that they can all live with. Don't have to have ultimate agreement. Neither is it a compromise, which means everybody gives up something. You hopefully will find some emergent possibilities that people can work with. One brief example of that. I worked with a disaster response team, 19 different agencies in Hull, all of whom wanted to develop a counselling system for activation in the event of a disaster. They'd done 18 months of conventional planning and got nowhere because of their different perspectives. And they came to us saying, can you help us do this? And we had 6 days to help them. And one of the interesting pieces of learning from that is that a lot of people complain that participatory and systemic approaches are time-consuming. Well, we managed to do in 6 days what they couldn't do in 18 months. So I think actually that's efficient as well as effective. So I'll just leave you with 3 systemic principles. I've talked about the 4 systems thinking skills. I've illustrated that with some approaches, some methods. And the first principle is explore boundaries and stakeholders and issues, values, processes of marginalisation up front in the work, and revisit the boundaries of your work when new aspects of a problem present themselves. That's really critically important, because I've seen too many consultants actually talk with management or policymakers, just take their view of the issue as given, work with that, and it ends up creating more problems than it solves. You must have that exploration up front. Because the whole point of a wicked problem is that it's not possible for one stakeholder to actually understand the whole. Second principle is drawing upon and mixing methods from across these systems approaches and across the biophysical and social sciences. So welcome that whole plurality. The old adage, if the only tool you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And the third one, which I talk with policymakers, is if you've got no previous experience or limited experience, start from where you are and work out from there. Find the next thing in systems thinking that might work and take that on. Big bugbear I've got is that when you become a doctor or an engineer, you spend 4 or 7 years at university. When you study systems thinking, you're supposed to pick it up in a weekend course. Well, it's not acceptable, but we have to live with it, which is why I end up telling policymakers start from where you are, because they probably won't get more than a weekend course. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gerald, and we've asked you to provide a weekend course in 20 minutes, so I appreciate the challenging task. So we opportunity now just for a few minutes for questions before we move on to our next speaker. So I'll keep an eye on Nikki as moderator for the online community, but other questions in the room for Gerald? Thank you.
Gerald, my question relates to stakeholders. We use the term stakeholder in lots of different ways. If it takes stake as being something that provides a basis for somebody being or not being a stakeholder, what then is the role of stakeholder management, particularly when you can't get accommodation? Dr. Alan McLucas from the University of New South Wales at Canberra. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I want to address that obliquely because I want to define stakeholders slightly differently. Most people think of stakeholders as being there's some kind of issue, and it's those people who are impacted by that issue. They're either involved in it or affected by it. I tend to think of it more broadly than that. You need to think about who ought to be involved as well as who is involved. So it's broader for a start. And stakeholder management, well, yeah, it's an important principle. In terms of a wicked problem, though, generally speaking, you're not talking about one agency. So when people talk about stakeholder management, most of the management literature is talking about what an organisation does to manage its stakeholders in a rather instrumental way. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about participatory engagement, and it invariably goes beyond the boundaries of what one organisation would regard as its stakeholders.
Thank you.
Maybe, Gerald, Associate Professor, I'll be very quick. Associate Professor Simon Ratkinson, University of Sydney. One of the big challenges we've had with the big change of government here is actually educating ministers from the professional class. Can you tell us of your experience and how you've overcome that so they can help solve some of the complex problems that face us?
With ministers, mostly I've actually worked with civil servants. Certainly in New Zealand, it tended to be working with the people behind the scenes rather than the ministers. And it is a big challenge. Absolutely, it's a big challenge. When I've involved politicians in workshops, I found that being absolutely fascinating. They have to have the experience of it. And it's not just politicians, managers in general. I've often been in situations where people have welcomed me in, but then at the end of the process they've said, well, I thought we did things systemically already, and now I realise there's a whole lot more to it than I didn't realise. So they need that experience of doing it. It's not something you can just learn in a classroom. In fact, one of the biggest challenges I found was reading all this work, doing a PhD in desk-based research, and then actually going out and doing it, and it's a whole different ballgame. So.
Okay, I think we've got time for one final question up the back here.
Hello, Zoe Safoulis from University of Western Sydney.
Sorry,
I just wanted to pick up on the point that you made about the youth project, where you got the youth in to find their points of view, and also another project you mentioned about not wanting to presuppose the questions before you consulted stakeholders. It seems to me a lot of people know that. I'm just wondering, know that that's a good process to consult with your stakeholders and your youth and everything. I just wondered what observations you might have made, unofficially or otherwise, about why politicians and policymakers consistently forget this.
Well, I've got multiple answers to that. One principle I think it's really important to bear in mind is, and it's important for interdisciplinarity as well as for that stakeholder engagement, is that boundaries enable as well as constrain. So people cling on to their boundaries because it actually is useful for them in some way. So when you're asking them to challenge those, you're really threatening the possibility they might lose the ability to control that they've got. So that's at a principle level what's going on. It's also about how you do it. I've seen some very naive approaches to doing that. And let me give you an example from that children's project. We went out on the streets at night to work with young people. And we were accompanied by a youth worker from the Children's Society, which is a charity in the UK. And so they were introducing us to young people. We were talking with them. And they were really shocked because these young people wanted to talk with us and they wanted to contribute their stories. And they said their whole youth work policy was about waiting for young people to come to them. So they'd be out there with soup kitchens, and they would wait sometimes 3 months for a young person to come to speak to them. And they realised they didn't have to do this. So the very first change that happened through that project was a change in their whole youth work approach that was spun right across the country in the end by that organisation. So that was just custom and practice, how they'd thought about it. They'd never done anything to challenge their assumption that young people wouldn't want to be approached. They would want to that they should wait to be approached.
And thanks to you for your questions. I'll ask you to join me in a second in thanking Gerald. Obviously some other questions we didn't get to today, and I would encourage the online participants as well to think about taking the opportunity to provide questions for future speakers. But please join me in thanking Gerald for a very stimulating talk.